Have you ever considered what it would be like to fall asleep in a house that is slowly filling with odorless carbon monoxide gas?
Oh man, that is a terrifying thought.
Right, but just picture the scene for a second. It is the dead of winter, the wind is howling outside, but inside your bedroom you are perfectly comfortable.
Yeah, you wouldn't even know anything is wrong.
Spot on. The heater is running, the blankets are heavy, and you are entirely unaware of the lethal threat accumulating in the air around you. You are just drifting into a quiet, warm, deadly slumber.
That is such a chilling image.
It really is. Your breathing slows down, your brain is being starved of oxygen, but your body registers no pain, no alarm at all. You are dying, but you feel absolutely fine.
Because the gas is totally undetectable.
Yes, and then suddenly a stranger outside picks up a heavy, jagged brick and hurls it right through your bedroom window.
Oh, wow.
The shattering glass is violent, the noise is jarring, the freezing winter wind comes rushing into your room, blowing all over your bed. It is an offensive, frightening disruption to your peace.
You would wake up terrified.
Startled, angry, and shivering. But that violent, offensive disruption is the very thing that wakes you up. It is the only thing that brings in the fresh oxygen needed to keep your lungs functioning.
I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, that startling analogy illustrates the precise condition of ancient Israel in the text we are looking at today. They were asleep. They had been lulled into a deadly, comfortable assimilation with their Philistine oppressors.
They were breathing in the toxic gas of a pagan culture.
They were, and they were mistaking it for peace. So God decides to throw a proverbial brick through their window, and he uses a highly flawed, chaotic, and violent man to shatter their lethal complacency. Okay, let's unpack this.
I'm ready.
Our mission today on this deep dive is to take a magnifying glass to Judges chapter 14 through a Reformed Protestant theological lens.
And we have some incredible source material for this.
We do. We are utilizing two highly detailed theological commentaries to look closely at how the sovereign God uses human folly and sin to bring about his righteous judgment and salvation.
It is a staggering historical situation to analyze.
So we are going to watch this play out in 3 acts. First, we will examine the anatomy of desire in the opening verses.
Right.
Then, we will take a bizarre detour with a lion and a carcass. And finally, we will witness a disastrous wedding feast that ends in absolute bloodshed.
To understand the sheer weight of what happens in Judges chapter 14, we first have to set the historical stage very carefully.
Yeah, context is everything here.
It really is. The text tells us right at the beginning of the Samson narrative in Judges 13.1 that Israel has been under Philistine rule for 40 years.
40 years, that is an entire generation.
A whole generation born into captivity. And what makes this specific period unique and quite chilling from a spiritual perspective is the silence of the Israelites.
What do you mean by silence?
Well, in previous cycles of oppression throughout the book of Judges, whenever a foreign nation would conquer Israel, the Israelites would eventually feel the sting of the whip, realize their rebellion, and cry out to God for deliverance.
They would beg for a savior.
Exactly. But here, under the Philistines, there is no cry. There is no prayer for deliverance at all.
Wait, really? None?
None.
Yeah.
They have become what the commentaries call Canaanized. They are entirely comfortable in their chains.
Wow, so they just accepted it.
They actually prefer assimilation with the surrounding pagan culture to the rigorous holiness that God requires of them.
That brings us back to the carbon monoxide analogy. They're
Yeah.
just comfortably asleep.
Spot on. And you have to understand, the Philistines were not just a random group of primitive raiders. They were a highly advanced, organized, seafaring people.
So they were culturally sophisticated.
Very much so. They were part of the sea peoples who had settled on the Mediterranean coast. They held a monopoly on ironworking.
Which gave them a massive military advantage, I would assume.
A huge advantage. They had sophisticated pottery, organized military structures, and a very cosmopolitan way of life. They were pressing their military and cultural influence up from the coastal plains into the hills of Judah and Dan.
So, to the original Israelite audience reading this history, the Philistines were the uncircumcised oppressors, living entirely outside the covenant of Yahweh.
Right. Yet the Israelites had signed a quiet, unwritten peace treaty with them in their hearts.
They were trading with them, interacting with them, and slowly becoming entirely indistinguishable from them.
That geographic and cultural reality changed how we read the very first sentence of chapter 14.
Yeah, let's look at the text. The passage points out that Samson went down to Timnah.
In Hebrew, the word is yarad, which means to descend.
Now, strictly speaking, geographically, Timnah is lower in elevation than Samson's hometown of Zorah, right?
Correct. Zorah is up in the rugged hills, and Timnah is down in the Sorek Valley, right on the border between Israelite territory and Philistine territory.
But the author is doing something highly intentional with that specific verb, isn't he?
Yes, he is. That physical descent is mirroring a severe moral and spiritual slide into paganism.
Samson is stepping down out of the heights of Israelite separation and walking right into the borderlands where the clear lines of God's covenant are getting very blurry.
And this fits right into the broader literary structure of the Samson cycle. Throughout the entire book of Judges, we see this tragic downward spiral in the character of the judges themselves.
You start early in the book with fairly noble leaders like Othniel, who goes to war and delivers the people, and you spiral all the way down to Samson.
Samson is this solitary, impulsive figure. He does not lead an army.
He does not rally the tribes at all.
No, he acts as a glaring foil to the righteous king that Israel truly needs.
That observation about his isolation is crucial. Samson operates almost entirely on personal impulse, unchecked emotion, and brute strength.
The literary structure of this chapter forces the reader to confront a man who has been set apart by God from the womb as a Nazirite.
A man dedicated to strict holiness.
Right, yet who consistently behaves like the surrounding pagan culture he is supposed to be fighting against.
So the author is not presenting Samson as a clean moral example to copy. It's not at all. He is presenting a highly flawed, chaotic judge whose personal internal disorder perfectly mirrors the wider spiritual disorder of the entire nation of Israel.
When you look at Samson, you are looking at Israel in a mirror.
That is a great way to put it. So let us look at the first section, the first 4 verses, where we see the anatomy of desire and divine providence.
The action starts immediately without any preamble. Samson goes down to Timnah, sees a Philistine woman, and immediately goes back up the hill to his parents.
And he makes a demand.
A very strong demand. He tells them to get her for him to be his wife. The speed of it is shocking. He goes down, he looks, and he makes a life-altering demand.
And the first thing we need to break down here is the concept the theological commentaries refer to as the lust of the eyes.
The text specifically notes that Samson saw this woman in Timnah. The Hebrew verb used here is ra.
Yes, ra. And in this specific context, this is not a passive, accidental glance while walking through the marketplace.
It is a purposeful, covetous gaze. Samson's desire is not rooted in the woman's character. It is certainly not based on her standing within the covenant community.
Because she is entirely outside of it.
Exactly. His desire is sparked purely by the visual and the sensual. He is prioritizing immediate, fleshly gratification over eternal holy parameters.
It reminds me of the original failure in the Garden of Eden. Eve saw that the fruit was good for food and a delight to the eyes.
That is a brilliant connection.
Lot saw the well-watered plains of Sodom. Now Samson sees a daughter of the uncircumcised Philistines. The eye is acting as the primary entry point for rebellion.
The eye is evaluating reality based on fleshly appetite rather than divine revelation. And his justification for this marital demand is absolutely chilling when you understand the Hebrew.
What does he say to his parents?
He tells them, "Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes." The Hebrew phrase there is hayashah b'nei.
Okay, what does that mean literally?
The word yashar means straight or upright. So Samson is not just saying, I find her physically attractive.
He is making a terrifying theological declaration.
Yes. He is establishing a rival throne of judgment. He is looking at a situation that God's law clearly condemns, and he is deciding for himself what is straight and what is correct.
Wow. He is substituting his own sensual assessment for the objective standard of the law that God has already handed down. This is the ultimate expression of human autonomy.
It really is.
Wait, so he is essentially setting up a rival throne in his own mind. He is acting as his own God. That completely changes how I read the phrase, right in his own eyes.
Right. It is not just a passing preference.
It is an act of legislative treason. He is writing his own moral law.
That is the perfect phrase. Legislative treason. That specific phrase echoes the most tragic refrain in the entire book of Judges, which we see at the very end of the book.
In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Spot on. Samson is the appointed judge. He's the one who is supposed to deliver the people from the Philistines and restore the law of God.
Yet, he embodies the very moral chaos that has brought the nation into bondage in the first place.
When a creature looks at the Creator's law and decides to substitute his own standard of what is straight, the very foundations of moral reality are subverted.
And you see the collision between his autonomy and God's law immediately in the reaction of his parents. His parents object to this demand.
They do, and their objection represents the voice of the Mosaic Law.
Specifically, Deuteronomy chapter 7, which strictly forbids intermarrying with the pagan nations of Canaan. This is the classic definition of the unequal yoke.
His parents ask him, with obvious distress, if there is no woman among all their own tribal relatives or among all their people.
Pointing out the absolute scandal that he is trying to marry into the uncircumcised Philistines, they recognize the cultural and religious catastrophe of what he is proposing.
Think about it practically. Marriage is designed to be a unified partnership pursuing the glory of God.
Trying to marry a Philistine is like trying to run a three-legged race where one person is supposed to be sprinting toward holiness and the other person is sprinting toward pagan idolatry and the worship of Dagon.
It is a structure designed for catastrophic collapse. The parents feel the horror of the situation.
Their protest is grounded in the covenant, even if it seems a bit muted compared to the extreme severity of the theological violation taking place.
But then, right after this domestic argument, the narrative introduces a massive theological pivot in verse 4.
The narrator pulls back the curtain on human history and gives us a brief, blinding glimpse into the high counsel of God.
The text says, "His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines."
Okay, we need to pause right here and spend some significant time unpacking this because this single verse is where a lot of people will get tricked up.
It is a challenging verse.
I have to step in and express the genuine confusion a listener might feel reading this. If Samson is blatantly violating God's law out of his own selfish lust,
Right.
if he is committing legislative treason by doing what is right in his own eyes, how on earth can the text say it was from the Lord?
That is the big question.
Does this mean God is forcing Samson to sin? Is God putting sinful desires into Samson's heart just to start a fight?
That is the critical question of the entire chapter. And to answer it, we must lean heavily into the Reformed doctrine of compatibilism.
Particularly as it is articulated in the Westminster Confession of Faith, Chapter 5, Article 4.
Yes, compatibilism teaches that God's absolute, meticulous sovereignty and human moral responsibility are not mutually exclusive concepts.
They exist together simultaneously without contradicting each other.
The confession states that God's providence extends even to the sins of men. But how? It is not by a bare permission where God just steps back, folds his arms, and watches the chaos happen passively.
Nor is God the author or instigator of the sin. God is completely holy and untouched by evil. James 1 is clear that God tempts no one.
Yet God bounds, orders, and directs those sinful events to his own holy ends.
So Samson is acting entirely out of his own corrupt, fallen nature.
He is fully 100% responsible for his lust. He wants the Philistine woman, and no one is forcing him to want her.
But God is sovereignly directing the outcome of that sinful impulse to accomplish a righteous judgment against the Philistines.
Precisely.
I want to make sure we are translating this dense theology into visceral reality. It is like watching a master chess player.
Oh, I like this analogy.
The master is playing against an opponent who makes an aggressive, highly flawed, completely illegal move based on their own arrogance and lack of skill.
Right.
Now, the master chess player did not force the opponent to make that terrible move, but instead of just stopping the game and flipping the board over, the master seamlessly incorporates that very flaw, that very arrogant mistake, to orchestrate a brilliant, multi-step, and unavoidable checkmate.
That is exactly what is happening here. Samson thinks he's just chasing a romantic interest down in Timnah. He thinks he is in control.
But God is utilizing that rebellious chase to initiate a holy war. God is kicking a fight.
And that brings us to the rare Hebrew word used at the end of verse 4, to Anna.
Which most English Bibles translate as occasion. What is the specific background of that word? Because it feels very heavy.
It is incredibly heavy. The word to Anna carries immense judicial and military weight.
How so?
In the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East, it refers to a legal pretext or a formal ground for breaking a treaty and declaring war.
Think of it like a casus belli in international law.
Right. God is the sovereign suzerain, the high king, and Israel is his vassal nation. But Israel has entered into this unholy, cowardly, comfortable peace with the Philistines.
They are too spiritually asleep, too poisoned by the carbon monoxide, to use our earlier analogy, to start a conflict themselves.
They will not throw the brick. So God uses Samson's fleshly, sinful demand for a Philistine bride as the tawana.
The legal pretext, the spark.
Yes, to pick a fight. He is acting as a righteous judge, sovereignly orchestrating a violent confrontation to break the chains that Israel has actually grown to love.
That reframes the entire narrative. God is so determined to save his people that he will use the moral failures of their leaders to disrupt their comfortable enslavement.
It shows his relentless dedication to his covenant.
So when we look at the authorial intended effect for this first section, what was the writer trying to accomplish in the minds of the original ancient Israelite audience who heard this read out loud?
The intended effect was a severe moral disturbance. The author designed these verses to expose the spiritual blindness of the entire nation.
By watching Samson arrogantly demand what is right in his own eyes, the original audience was meant to see their own reflection staring back at them.
They were meant to realize that their comfortable assimilation with the Philistines, their intermarrying, their trading, their silence, it was not a state of peace.
It was a state of death.
Furthermore, verse 4 was intended to humble them profoundly before the majesty of divine providence.
They needed to know that even when their leaders were failing miserably, even when the nation was in a moral freefall, Yahweh was still meticulously in control,
Refusing to let his people remain happily enslaved.
Let us move into the second act of our narrative. Secret strength and hidden defilement, covering verses 5 through 9.
This is a fascinating section.
Samson and his parents head down toward Timnah to make the arrangements for the wedding. On the road, traveling through this borderland, Samson takes a detour. He finds himself in the vineyards of Timnah.
We have to stop and recognize the severity of his location. The vineyards of Timnah represent a massive violation of Samson's Nazirite consecration.
The parameters of the Nazirite vow are outlined clearly in Numbers chapter 6.
A Nazirite was strictly forbidden from consuming any product of the vine. They could not eat fresh grapes, they could not eat dried raisins, and they certainly could not drink wine or a strong drink.
They were not supposed to be anywhere near the production of these things.
Yet here is Samson, the lifelong Nazirite, wandering right into the orchards of temptation. He's playing with fire.
And it is in this specific place of potential compromise, this vineyard, that a young lion, a kafir, comes roaring at him.
This is not an old, toothless lion. A kafir is a beast in the absolute prime of its predatory strength, hunting for a kill.
The timing is incredible. Right at the moment of maximum danger, right when he is caught in the wrong place, the text says, "The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him."
The Hebrew word there is salak.
Let us pause and clarify what this means, especially from a reformed cessationist theological framework.
It is a vital distinction to make.
Because a modern listener hears the phrase, "the Spirit came upon him," and they may instantly map that onto the New Testament reality of a Christian being internally filled and sanctified by the Holy Spirit.
Right, they might think Samson is having a moment of deep spiritual renewal.
But that is not what is happening here, is it?
No, mixing those two concepts up causes a lot of confusion. In the Old Testament theocratic economy, this rushing of the Spirit is not the normative indwelling sanctification that all believers experience today.
It is not an internal washing or a regeneration of the heart.
It is what theologians call a charism of office.
Yeah.
It was a specific, temporary external equipping for a holy war task.
God grants Samson supernatural physical might to execute his office as a judge and a deliverer.
Think of it like a soldier putting on an advanced, powered exoskeleton suit.
Oh, that is a great visual.
The suit gives the soldier the ability to lift a car and punch through concrete. But the suit does not change the soldier's moral character.
It does not make him a kinder or more righteous person. It just makes him exceptionally dangerous.
God drops this external might onto Samson. With this divine momentary strength, Samson grabs this roaring young lion and tears it apart barehanded, as easily as someone might tear apart a young goat.
He wins this incredible solitary victory against a terrifying beast, but then he does something very strange.
He keeps it a complete secret.
He regains the road, meets back up with his parents, and does not say a single word about what just happened. The story then jumps forward in time.
Later, he is traveling back along that same road to finally claim his bride for the wedding feast.
He decides to turn aside and check on the carcass of that lion he killed. When he gets to the remains, he finds a very unusual biological occurrence.
A swarm of bees has built a hive, and there's a deposit of honey inside the dehydrated, sun-baked carcass of the beast.
Samson reaches his hands into the rib cage, scrapes the honey out, eats it as he walks, and then later shares it with his parents without ever telling them where he got it.
This specific scene exposes the hidden internal defilement in Samson's life.
By reaching in and touching the dead carcass of the lion, Samson is once again blatantly violating his Nazirite vow.
Number 6 is exceedingly strict about avoiding dead bodies. Contact with a corpse brought immediate ritual impurity.
But Samson completely ignores the law. He prioritizes his sensual appetite, his fleshly desire for the sweet honey, over his covenantal separation to God.
He treats his holy calling with complete carelessness. And what makes it worse is the collateral damage.
He draws his parents into his ritual uncleanness without their knowledge or consent.
He shares the defiled honey with them, making the very people who tried to warn him about the Philistine woman participants in his failure.
It paints such a stark contrast between giftedness and godliness.
It really does.
Samson has this supernatural, jaw-dropping physical might, but he has zero self-discipline. He has absolutely no reverence for the things of God.
Here's a man who can literally tear a lion limb from limb, but he cannot say no to his own stomach.
He cannot control his basic impulses. It is terrifying when you think about it.
That is the core tragedy of his character, and it is a warning for every generation. He possesses the raw strength of the Spirit for his office, but he completely lacks the discipline of the Word in his personal life.
It forces the reader to separate visible effectiveness from true holiness.
Samson is highly effective at killing lions, but he is completely ineffective at governing his own soul. He's a conqueror of beasts, but a slave to his own appetites.
Which brings us to the authorial intended effect for this second section. Why include this bizarre, highly specific story about a lion and a honey-filled carcass?
How was this supposed to impact the original Israelite audience sitting in their tents listening to this?
Right.
It functioned as a sharp, unavoidable rebuke against their spiritual carelessness. The author was forcing the nation to recognize that outward privilege, or even historical divine equipping, does not guarantee inward faithfulness.
Israel, much like Samson, had been chosen, set apart, and blessed by God with miraculous victories in the past.
Yet they were living carelessly among the pagan nations, treating their covenant with God as if it were an old, meaningless tradition.
The intended effect was to make the audience feel a deep sense of alarm at how easily consecration can be emptied of its seriousness.
It warned them not to rest on their historical privileges, while their hearts remained utterly wayward and defiled by the surrounding culture.
That is a heavy, necessary warning, and it sets the stage for the explosive conclusion of this narrative in our third act.
The feast, the riddle, and the violent rupture.
Covering verses 10 through 20. Samson goes all the way down to Timnah to finalize the marriage, and he throws a 7-day feast.
Now, the English word feast sounds like a polite banquet, maybe a nice dinner with some speeches.
But the Hebrew word used here is mishete.
The word mishe completely changes the tone of the event. It comes from the root shala, which literally means to drink.
So this is not a formal dinner party. It is a 7-day unrestrained drinking bout.
This was the standard cultural practice for Philistine weddings. The irony here is thick and tragic.
The Nazirite, the man who is strictly forbidden from touching the fruit of the vine, the man who is supposed to be the holy judge of Israel, is now the guest of honor presiding over a week-long pagan kegger.
He is fully submerging himself into the debauched culture of the enemy.
And in the middle of this drinking bout, surrounded by 30 Philistine companions who have been assigned to him, probably as a kind of security detail as much as groomsman Samson decides to flex his intellectual muscles.
He loves playing games. He poses a riddle to the room.
He says, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet.
He backs this riddle up with a massive high-stakes wager. He bets 30 linen garments, called sednim, and 30 festal clothes, called shalitzot.
We need to understand the economics here. In the ancient world, clothing was incredibly valuable.
30 sets of high-end linen undergarments and 30 sets of ornate outer garments is an enormous amount of wealth.
It is the equivalent of betting 30 luxury cars.
It is an act of immense pride. He is essentially mocking them, betting on a secret that no one in the room could possibly guess.
Because the answer is based entirely on his own private, bizarre experience with the lion carcass.
It reveals his massive ego and his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. He thinks he can domesticate his relationship with the Philistines.
He thinks he can sit at their table, play their drinking games, outsmart them with his riddles, and maintain the upper hand.
Yeah, he thinks he's in control. But he completely misjudges the nature of the people he is trying to ally himself with.
When the 30 Philistine men spend 3 days trying to solve the riddle and realize they are going to lose this massive sum of wealth, Their reaction exposes the sinister, violent reality of their culture.
They bypass Samson entirely. They go to his new bride, the woman he supposedly loves, and they issue a horrific threat.
They tell her to coax the answer out of Samson, or they will burn her and her father's house to the ground.
That is a staggering, terrifying escalation.
They go from playing a party game over drinks to threatening to burn a woman and her family alive. It pulls the mask completely off the situation.
It highlights the absolute treachery of aligning with the ungodly. The world's friendship is often just a mask for coercion.
The Philistines do not care about fairness, they do not care about the rules of the wager, and they certainly do not care about Samson's marriage.
They care about their honor and their wealth, and they will use sheer, brutal terror to protect it.
So the bride is terrified. She knows her own people well enough to know they are not bluffing. She resorts to weaponized emotion.
She cries and weeps in front of Samson for the rest of the 7-day feast.
She accuses him, saying, "You only hate me, you do not love me. You have put a riddle to my people, and you have not told me what it is."
She wears him down with relentless emotional manipulation.
And here is the profound, well, the massive irony. The strong man who just tore a lion apart with his bare hands without breaking a sweat is reduced to absolute wax by the tears of a woman he barely knows.
He cannot handle the emotional pressure. On the 7th day, he finally caves and tells her the secret.
She immediately turns around and hands the answer over to the Philistine men.
When the men come to Samson, right before the sun goes down on the final day, and recite the answer, Samson knows exactly what happened.
He knows he has been betrayed. He bitterly replies with a very coarse, provocative proverb. "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle."
That coarse, bitter statement from Samson is incredibly revealing about the true nature of their relationship.
It shows the total collapse of the false peace he tried to build.
He thought he was getting a loyal wife, but he realizes she is entirely aligned with his enemies.
The theological commentary cross-references the specific moment of betrayal with Micah 7.5.
Which warns the people of God against trusting in a friend or putting confidence in a guide, pointing out the total depravity of the human heart and the futility of earthly alliances.
Samson thought he could find loyalty, love, and safety outside the covenant boundaries of God, but all he found was coercion and betrayal.
The narrative then moves rapidly into its violent conclusion in verses 19 and 20.
The Spirit of the Lord rushes upon Samson one more time. He leaves the feast in Timnah, burning with anger.
He walks 20 miles down to the coast to a major fortified Philistine city called Ashkelon.
He finds 30 men there, strikes them down, and kills them. He strips them of their gear. The Hebrew word is chalitza, which specifically refers to military armor and clothing.
And he takes that bloody spoil all the way back to Timnah to pay the debt to the 30 groomsmen who solved the riddle.
Then, still burning with rage, he abandons his new bride and goes back up the hill to his father's house.
The bride is then casually given away to his best man. The whole wedding is a smoldering ruin.
The theological weight of this violent rupture cannot be overstated. We have to connect this back to verse 4.
This bloodshed in Ashkelon is the fulfillment of the divine plan. This is the Tawana, the legal occasion that God was seeking all along.
The unholy peace treaty between Israel and Philistia has been shattered, not by a polite diplomatic negotiation, but by a sovereignly ordained, violent rupture.
The alliance is completely desecrated by blood. God forces a strict, undeniable separation between his people and the world.
He will not allow the covenant community to just quietly blend in with the pagans.
He uses Samson's wounded pride and his violent temper to strike a blow against the oppressors.
What was the authorial intended effect for this final bloody section of the story?
The author designed this violent conclusion to demonstrate to the original Israelite audience the treacherous, lethal reality of aligning with the world.
It was meant to permanently shatter their illusion that they could peacefully assimilate with the Philistines.
The message is painfully clear. The world's peace is a trap that always ends in betrayal and fire.
The narrative calls the nation to strict covenantal separation, showing them that God himself will disrupt their compromises, even through terrifying means,
to maintain his holy purposes and protect his own glory.
If we pull back from the specific verses and synthesize all of this, looking at the overall authorial intended effects for the entire chapter, what is the grand takeaway for the original audience?
The entire chapter functions as a severe corporate rebuke. It exposes the quiet compromises occurring in their own living rooms, the Canaanization of their daily lives.
But more than just scolding them, It creates a holy dissatisfaction.
It makes them dissatisfied with their current state of affairs and deeply disappointed with their flawed, impulsive leaders.
The author is stripping away their pride and preparing their hearts to long for something far better.
They are meant to realize, through the utter failure of Samson's character, that they desperately need a righteous, messianic king who delights in the law of the Lord,
Rather than a carnal judge who does what is right in his own eyes. Here's where it gets really interesting, because the story of Samson does not just leave us sitting in the dirt of human failure.
No, it doesn't.
This dark, messy, violent chapter actually points us forward in biblical history. How does Samson's chaotic life point us to Christ?
We have to state very clearly right at the outset that Samson is not a moral template for us to copy.
You do not read Judges 14 and say, I should be more like Samson.
He is a historical type that points forward to a perfect antitype, Jesus Christ. He is a shadowy, distorted reflection of the substance that is to come.
Let us look at a few specific parallels. First, consider the solitary victories.
Samson faced the roaring lion completely alone in the vineyards of Timnah. No one was there to help him.
In a far greater, eternal way, Jesus Christ faced the roaring lion of Satan alone on the cross.
As the Apostle Paul tells us in Colossians 2:15, Christ spoiled principalities and powers, triumphing over them completely alone.
He needed no assistance from any human army to win our redemption.
None at all.
I love how the great preacher Charles Spurgeon handled this exact text in his famous sermon, Hands Full of Honey.
Oh, that is a classic.
He uses the analogy of Samson's riddle to explain the entire gospel. Out of the eater, which represents death, the law, and the holy wrath of God against sin, comes the meat of our justification.
Out of the strong, terrifying judgment of God comes the sweetness of eternal grace.
And just like Samson's parents, we did not fight the beast. We were not there when the lion was slain. We did not contribute to the victory.
But we get to freely eat the sweetness of Christ's finished work. We hold our hands out and receive the honey of salvation that he secured for us alone.
That is a brilliant theological connection. We must also contrast the two bridegrooms.
Samson went down to Timnah to seek a bride among his enemies, but he did it for entirely selfish, carnal reasons, driven by lust, and it ended in bitter betrayal.
Jesus Christ also sought a bride among his enemies, because the New Testament is clear that we were all children of wrath, alienated from God.
But Christ did not seek us for selfish gain. He willingly laid down his life to cleanse his bride and make her holy.
Samson's bride betrayed him to save her own skin from the fire, but Christ gave his life to save his bride from the eternal fire of judgment.
And we also have to look at the cross as the final, ultimate to Anna.
Just as God used Samson's sinful impulses, his fleshly demands, and his violent temper to orchestrate a judgment against the Philistines,
God used the wicked, sinful actions of Judas Iscariot, the envy of the religious leaders, and the cowardice of Pontius Pilate to bring about the salvation of the world.
Acts 2.23 makes this explicitly clear, stating that Christ was delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God.
Even though he was crucified by the hands of lawless men.
God is the sovereign architect of redemption, using even the darkest human treachery to accomplish his brilliant light.
The Christological fulfillment of Judges 14 leads us directly to worship. It shows us that physical strength alone cannot save.
An external calling alone cannot save.
We do not need a physically strong champion who breaks the rules. We need a flawless, righteous Redeemer who obeys the Father perfectly in our place.
Samson's colossal failures create a huge hunger for the perfection of Jesus Christ.
They absolutely do.
That brings the high theology right down to earth. So what does this require of the listener today? Let us move into the application of this text for the modern believer living right now.
The first major application is the absolute necessity to mortify the flesh. We must learn to actively distrust the judgment of our own hearts.
The loud cultural mantra today is to follow your heart, to do what feels right to you, to live your own truth.
To do what is right in your own eyes.
Believers must reject that framework completely. We have to submit our personal desires entirely to the objective standard of the Word of God.
Sin almost always starts with a private, visual desire, just like Samson seeing the woman in Timnah. We must cut off those desires at the root before they ripen into public ruin.
The second application ties directly into what we discussed about the drinking feast in Timnah.
We must reject pragmatism and the unequal yoke. We cannot adopt the methods of the world to try and win the world.
If we try to sit at the world's drinking feast, play their games, and laugh at their riddles, we are going to be compromised.
We must flee from spiritual and relational compromise. The world will offer you a sort of peace, a comfortable assimilation, but it is a trap that always ends in betrayal.
We have to maintain our distinct, holy identity as a covenant people, even when it is uncomfortable.
The third application deals with the dangerous distinction between giftedness and godliness. We must recognize that character matters infinitely more than charisma.
In the modern church, it is very easy to confuse ministry effectiveness or visible talent on a stage with true, quiet holiness.
A person might be incredibly gifted, able to speak well, lead large organizations, or draw a crowd, but have a completely hollow, undisciplined inner life.
We must not confuse outward ability with inward purity.
We need to rely on the ordinary means of grace, the faithful preaching of the word, the administration of the sacraments, and corporate prayer.
To build our character, rather than seeking emotional highs or resting on our talents.
And finally, we must rest in sovereign providence. There is massive, unshakable comfort for the believer in the doctrine of compatibilism when it is rightly understood.
When you look at the chaotic news cycle, human history, or even when you look at your own personal failures and the messy situations in your own life,
You can know that God is meticulously ordering all events for his holy purposes. You are not at the mercy of blind chance or human malice.
rest completely in the imputed righteousness of Jesus Christ, our flawless Savior. He has already won the secret victory over the lion.
That is the ultimate resting place for the Christian soul. We trust in a God who is vastly larger than our mistakes and a Savior whose perfect obedience covers our spectacular failures.
So what does this all mean? As we bring this deep dive to a close, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought.
It's a vital question to ask.
Think back to that analogy we started with. Consider the areas in your own life where you have signed a quiet, comfortable peace treaty with the surrounding culture.
Are you comfortably asleep in a house that is slowly filling with poison?
And if you are you willing to ask the sovereign God to throw a brick through your window to wake you up, no matter how much the shattering glass might startle you? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.